Nancy Mowll Mathews began her studies of Marie Cassatt and French and American Impressionism with her PhD dissertation for the Institute of Fine Arts, NYU. Of the more than 15 books and exhibitions she has produced on this subject, the best known are Cassatt and Her Circle, Selected Letters, Cassatt, The Color Prints, and Mary Cassatt, Alive. Most recently, she curated and co-wrote the catalog for Mary Cassatt, an American Impressionist in Paris, for the Jacquemart-André Museum in Paris in 2018. She is the Emerita Eugénie Prendergast Senior Curator of 19th and 20th Century Art at the Williams College Museum of Art, and also taught in the Williams College Art Department and Graduate Program. In addition to her work on Cassatt, she is the co-author of the Prendergast Catalogue Raisonné and numerous other books on Maurice and Charles Prendergast, Paul Gauguin, and the relationship between art and early film. So we're pleased to present Nancy. Oh, okay. So you should be able to station. You guys can help you so you can let me know.
Okay. You'll see. You'll see what that was all about. Oh my God. Okay.
Be sure that I can give you a handheld if you prefer.
No, this is fine. Okay. All right. So we just heard about Blanche Hoschedé-Monet's career, her painting alongside of Monet, but without Monet. What I'm going to talk about today is when the painter doesn't paint. What do you do? You're a painter. You've spent all this time trying to learn your craft. You've studied with the great masters, and then boom, no more painting. What do you do? If Blanche Hoschedé-Monet has a place in art history surveys of Impressionism, it is for not painting. She is given credit for her selflessness, her willingness to give up painting in order to care for the aging Claude Monet, her stepfather and father-in-law. This photograph that you've already seen, this photograph of her, and you will see many times before I'm done, and maybe even later, who knows. This photograph of her hovering over Monet's painting with her niece photobombing in the foreground sums up the common understanding of her as a traditional, dutiful daughter, putting the needs of family first at the expense of her own profession. Now, raise this up a little bit. It's a little low for me. That's perfect. Great. Thanks. I'm just going to go back for a second. Clemenceau called her Monet's angel. But in my talk today, I would like to examine more closely those years from 1913 to 1926, when it is believed she did not paint, to see if it might not have been as creative a time for her as it was for Monet. I would like to hypothesize that the water lilies on the easel you see in the photograph, and the pond, which was right next to them, and even the whole Monet estate in Giverny, provide the crucial setting for the artistic exploration of both artists, even though Monet only is here shown at the easel. I'm especially interested in this topic because the angel, quote unquote, of the teens would have been a surprise to those who knew Hoschedé-Monet before, especially when she was just starting out as a painter. This lithograph of her, which was published about 1894, shows her as a doer, not an observer. Part 1, Modern Woman. Hoschedé-Monet was of the demographic that defined modern woman of the late 19th century. The daughter of well-educated and free-thinking parents, she took her place in an international community of young artists at Giverny. This lithograph was made from a drawing by Monet after the painting by Monet on the right of Hoschedé-Monet from about 1888, when Blanche was around 23 years old. And we've heard a lot about Blanche in this year because that was when she painted the Salon Submission. It shows her in the foreground, painting presumably a garden landscape, while a male artist in the background works on his canvas, observed by another young woman. Hope you can see that. The lithograph, titled with her name, Blanche Hoschedé, a Blanche Hoschedé painting, was the last of 20 in an album that Monet did with the art publisher William Thornley. You see the cover page on the upper left. Monet made drawings for the lithographic stones after a selection of his paintings from the previous 2 decades, probably starting on this drawing project in 1892. It was a kind of virtual retrospective exhibition, as Jim Gantz called it in The Unknown Monet. Monet chose 2 other paintings that featured his stepdaughters. Woman with a Parasol of 1886, which is of Suzanne Hoschedé, and Young Girl in the Garden at Giverny of 1888, which is of Germaine Hoschedé. So the album has a bit of a family flavor. And you know this photograph from the exhibition. The blended family of the Monets and the Hoschedés was an impressive one in the town of Giverny. It consisted, of course, of Claude Monet and Alice Hoschedé, there's Claude and there's Alice, and the 2 youngest sons, Michel Monet, who's sitting next to Alice, and Jean-Paul Hoschedé down here. Blanche is sitting next to the man who would become, there she is, sitting next to Jean Monet, the man who would become her husband. Behind them is Jacques Hoschedé, the older son of the Hoschedés. And then the 3 sisters, Martha, sitting here in white, Suzanne, in this pattern dress, and Germaine behind them. Suzanne would marry the American artist Theodore Butler, have 2 children, and tragically die in 1899. Butler would then marry Martha, in white here, who would continue to raise the 2 children, both in the United States. They traveled back and forth between the United States and Giverny. Germaine would marry the attorney Albert Salarou and have 2 daughters, Nisha, who we saw photobombing the scene at Giverny, and Simone, or Cece, who is the grandmother of Philippe, who we will hear from a little later today. I emphasize the family because although Blanche became the last of the children to stay at Giverny during the First World War, before and after the war, the other children also played a role in supporting Monet and his art during this time. It was only during the war that Blanche was the only one of the family. So I want to give credit where credit is due. The other kids played their part. Of the 8 Monet Hoschedé children, however, only Blanche became an artist. And those of you who are artists or musicians or whatever, and your kids don't do it, I mean, this is the way it was in the Monet household. At least they had Blanche. At least they had Blanche. And it was a huge part of her identity. When Monet painted her, it was usually in front of an easel. When others painted her, it was the same. The John Leslie Breck painting, which is the one in the middle and the top, shows her with Monet behind her. The Monet painting, you'll remember, shows her with Breck behind her. So they're on either sides of her, both painting her. She was the star. She was it. Also, there's this interesting painting by Sargent of Monet down here on the boat where he painted, with an artist sitting next to him, also at an easel, who is also believed to be Blanche. Blanche was always painting, it seems, at least when she was around other artists. These works also show her collegiality with Monet. As the American artist and Giverny Theodore Robinson put it in 1892, they both liked to work together. I mean, it was noticeable to other people. They just liked to work together. And the works that they produced were not only interesting, but they were sympathetic with each other, never repetitive, as Galina has pointed out. And this was unusual for Monet, who seldom liked to work with younger artists, especially the hero-worshipping artists of Giverny, who would repeat his aesthetic theories back to him. So annoying. Finally, the environment in Giverny was particularly welcoming to women artists who were achieving breakthroughs in education, travel, and opportunities to exhibit by 1890. Monet's fellow impressionist, Berthe Morisot, whose work you see here on the left, was a friend of the family, especially because her daughter Julie, also studying to be an artist, was a close friend of Germaine, the youngest Hoschedé daughter, and they visited Giverny often. So it was a very sort of social family group. For the American women of Giverny, there was the special occasion of the planned Women's Building to feature female accomplishments at the upcoming World's Columbian Exposition, to be held in Chicago in 1893. Bertha Palmer, who's shown here, was the president of the Women's Building and visited Giverny with her husband at this time and bought one of the Hoschedé-Monet paintings. So she was well appreciated by this group of strong women. Mary McMonnies, who had been chosen to paint one of the large murals for the pavilion, visited Giverny with her, visited often, finally buying a house there. She's shown on the bottom. And of course, Mary Cassatt, another colleague of Monet's in the Impressionist group, was also well known to the family. She worked on her own mural called Modern Woman, appropriately enough, for the Women's Building at her summer estate not too far from Giverny, and worked with the theme of women picking fruit from the tree of knowledge and sharing it among them. This is the feminist environment in which Hoschedé-Monet matured as an artist. Part 2, Monet's Angel. In the 2 decades between the publication of Blanche Hoschedé painting of 1894 and the photograph of Blanche Hoschedé-Monet with Monet and Nisha Salarou, 1915, it appears that the artist underwent an extraordinary change. From the fashionable, iconic, modern woman being observed as she works, she is transformed into a rather dowdy, secondary figure, leaning over to observe someone else paint. She leans forward, seemingly to try to help. Monet's working method at Giverny in the later years was to have several canvases of similar motifs in process, And throughout the day, he would have his helpers bring one canvas after another. In this photograph, we get the impression that Hoschedé-Monet is leaning over to see if Monet was finished. Are you finished, monsieur? And if he needed a new painting, to work on. In her youth, as Galina mentioned, Hoschedé-Monet would physically haul around canvases and art supplies when she and Monet would go out to the countryside to paint. At this point, she was probably the one to get the estate workers to do the heavy lifting. Nevertheless, by 1915, it was no longer Monet who was making the arrangements for his painting routine. It was Hoschedé-Monet. How did this happen? Not only does it seem unlikely that the elegant artiste would turn into the solicitous caretaker, but why Blanche of all that large family? First of all, it was a shock that Alice Hoschedé-Monet, the woman who became Monet's wife and was the mother of all those children, developed leukemia and died in 1911 at the age of 67. Very unexpected. She had been the manager of the Giverny estate and its employees with Monet for over 25 years, which included the stock of paintings, not just the grounds and the house, but it was the stock of paintings by Monet and his friends, which were super valuable. And second, it was even more improbable that Blanche's husband, Jean Monet, would fall ill and die in 1914 at the age of 46. Monet had stopped painting at the death of his wife, vowing that he was done. Hoschedé-Monet had herself stopped painting to care for Jean. In 1913, they moved to a house Monet bought for them in Giverny. Monet and Hoschedé-Monet, now living in the same town for the first time in about 15 years, were similarly incapacitated by grief. It would have been reasonable to assume that the care of the aging artist would have fallen to one of Blanche's other sisters, such as Martha, who is shown here at the top. This is the wedding picture of her marriage to Theodore Butler. Remember, he had been married to her sister Suzanne, and then married Martha. Or Germaine, over here on the far right in the white dress. Having trouble with that. But those two were more traditional women, wives, mothers, or it could have been Michel Monet, the youngest Monet son, or Jean-Pierre Hoschedé, the youngest Hoschedé son, both of whom were close to Monet. All of them could have helped, all of them. And if Blanche had pulled herself together after the death of her husband and decided that now was the time to become a full-time painter, which would have been a reasonable thing for her to decide, she might have led the rest of her life on her own terms. But less than 6 months after her husband died, everything became more difficult. It was the beginning of World War I. Michel and Jean-Pierre served in the army. The Butlers left for the United States. And Germaine and her family left for the south of France. Many of the employees of the Monet estate similarly left town. In some ways, Blanche was it. It's also important to remember that at the end of the war in 1918, the siblings and the employees came back. Blanche's tour of duty might have ended there. But the fact that she continued to handle all of Monet's personal and professional business is a strong indication that she liked what she was doing. Even after Monet's death in 1926, when Michel Monet inherited Claude Monet's entire holdings, she continued as the manager of the Giverny estate and all the remaining artworks. The many documentary photographs of Monet in the late period attest to everything that Hoschedé-Monet did for him, from the layout of the third studio to the neat array of art supplies on the work tables. As for the Nymphaeus, that is the series of water lilies in the Orangerie in Paris, as for the Nymphaeus project, which required enormous canvases. Just think of it. Just think of how difficult that was. Endless art supplies. How much white paint you had to order to make this happen. And delicate negotiations with the French state. Hoschedé-Monet was in charge of making it happen. The photograph on the right shows all the major players, with Hoschedé-Monet in the center. She was in the center. Was she an angel? She certainly stepped up for Monet, for his art and legacy, at the expense of what might have been her prime as an artist. In this regard, she was one of a special group of caretakers of the aging Impressionists. By the teens, Renoir, Degas, and Cassatt were the only remaining members of the main group. Their fame and the value of their works still in their possession made the management of their remaining days akin to running a small corporation. In addition, Monet and Renoir, although somewhat incapacitated, were still painting, still adding to the stock. The case of Renoir, who was living in Cagnes in the south of France on an estate like Monet's, was very similar. His wife, who had been his manager, died suddenly in 1915. Their sons, Pierre and Jean, were drafted during the war. But Jean was injured and returned home to help his father. Like Hoschedé-Monet, Jean Renoir was the artistic caretaker who helped his father with the last monumental painting, The Bathers, which I'm showing you here, which required, it was huge, it's huge, required special materials and devices to allow his father to paint. Like the Nymphaeus, the water lilies, The Bathers was then donated to the French state in 1923. Degas did not have children to impress into service, like Monet and Renoir, but he did have a large family and an extensive support system. When he was forced to move into a new apartment in 1912, his huge collection of paintings, his own as well as the objects for his planned museum, overwhelmed him. His longtime housekeeper, Zoé Clozier, shown here on the left, who for decades was an excellent caretaker, was also overwhelmed. The two of them needed help. And so Mary Cassatt contacted Jeanne Fèvre, who was the daughter of Degas' sister, Marguerite Degas-Fèvre. Jeanne was living in the south of France at that time. Jean Fèvre, like Jean Renoir, later wrote about her time with the famous artist in Mon Oncle Degas, published in 1949. Although she was not an artist herself, she quickly became versed in the issues of Degas' art, especially in regard to the casting of his wax sculptures. Like Renoir and Monet, she oversaw the production of his last works, such as the bronze casting of The Little Dancer of 14 Years, which started in 1920, and you all know that work. When the filmmaker Sacha Guitry came to Degas' apartment in 1915 to discuss including him in the patriotic film Ceux de chez nous, or Our Countrymen, showcasing France's most prominent artists, Degas refused to participate. You can just picture that, right? It's like, no, bye. But Fèvre, Jean Fèvre, was also there. And she took Degas for a walk on their usual route and seems to have allowed Guitry to secretly film the two of them. And you can see a still from the film in the middle. Finally, Mary Cassatt, who, like Degas and Monet, suffered from deteriorating eyesight, gave up painting in 1914. Active and social, as you can see here in the photograph on the left from the Durand-Ruel archives, she was able to use her country estate, Beaufresne, like Monet and Renoir used theirs, as a landscape work of art, including a pond and flower gardens. During the war, she lost temporarily her longtime housekeeper, Mathilde Vallée, on the right, who was of German birth and had to leave France. But her dear friend, Louisine Havemeyer, in a pastel in the middle, formed a kind of tag team, helping each other keep informed of Cassatt's needs, both professionally and personally. The use of art for the public good was motivating all of them, all of these artists during the war, in the teens. And in addition to supporting the women's suffrage movement, the three worked to place important paintings into American collections and ensure Cassatt's legacy for the ages. Those who helped the aging Impressionists certainly did so at their own expense. That is, loss of time and focus on their own concerns. It changed them forever. But it was an unusual privilege to help a great artist, especially if they were still creating, like Monet was, and to play a part in the shaping of world culture. Part 3, Creative Times. Blanche Hoschedé-Monet had that rare opportunity, and she did not begrudge what it took from her own painting. If we look at another photograph from a little earlier in 1915, we perhaps get a better glimpse of the real person who found herself suddenly in charge of the welfare of her quote-unquote father. Still dressed in black for the year after her husband's death, this photo must have been taken in February. Hands on hips, alert to the exchange between the two, this lively creature was certainly the one who helped Monet build the third studio for the large water lily paintings, which is behind them. Looking back at the famous photo of her a few months later, now dressed in white, perhaps we're misinterpreting it. In some ways, this photo is theatrical, staged. As Monet liked to be, he was very theatrical, liked to present himself in a certain way. He liked to have custom-made shirts and wore these quote-unquote country suits. So it's this combination of luxury and hard work. The painting on the easel seems to be finished. It's the one that's now in Portland. You can hardly see any changes between what's on the easel and the painting today. Also, he's supposed to be painting, but do you see a palette or brushes? I mean, they could be there. I just can't see them. Anyway, that, it's like a rehearsal. It's like staging for the photograph. And so Blanche herself, who is really this very lively, very energetic, very dynamic person, may be herself playing the role of angel, obsequiously tending to the needs of the old painter. She certainly wanted people to believe that. When friends later wrote about Blanche preparing Monet's canvases, which says some reports were that she was the one who would do the underpainting or the preparing of the canvases. And that would have totally made sense. She was the only one on that estate who knew how to do it. It's not like you could get the pool man. She was doing it. Theoretically. However, she vehemently denied it. She said it would have been a sacrilege for her hand to be part of his paintings. Fair enough. Her brother, Jean-Pierre, later wrote his book about Monet, Ce Mal Connu, that is the not very well-known artist, of 1916, which was partially based on her own writings. They're included in the book. He stated definitively that she stopped painting completely until Monet's death in 1926, so as to support Monet's final accomplishments. This stance reinforces Hoschedé-Monet's image as angel, and in a practical sense, it reinforces the authenticity of Monet's paintings, and thus their monetary value upon which Michel Monet and Hoschedé-Monet would rely for the rest of their lives. But even if it is true that the angel, quote unquote, was actually doing some underpainting for the water lilies, as Janine Burke in her book, Monet, The Color of Time, spells out, it was not the same as being able to create her own works. Hoschedé-Monet's own paintings of the lily pond attest to her creative use of her time helping Monet. As we take yet another look at the photograph, we can interpret her pose as not just helping Monet, but an intense study of the painting. She's looking at the painting, his technique, and the motif. For her own work, she takes a more conventional view of receding space and almost eliminates the water with its reflections that Monet highlighted in his painting. But the denseness of the paint, almost a subject in and of itself, is a shared effect of both paintings. When, then, did she paint these water lilies? Stylistically, it is reminiscent of the Columbus Museum's Weeping Willows, which Columbus has dated in the 1890s and is one of the paintings downstairs. But are these two works comparable to the twinned canvases we saw before, which are more securely dated to the 1890s? Putting them side by side, we see that both sets are stylistically compatible, but the two water lilies are distinct from the earlier views of the Seine. In the water lilies, both artists are interpreting the water and foliage with an impasto that emphasizes the surface of the canvas in a very abstract 20th century way. In each pair, the works are obviously by different artists, but one might say that each time they are in conversation with one another. One work by Hoschedé-Monet in a similar style is dated 1927 in her hand, thanks to the conservation work done here at the Eskenazi. In this year, a year after Monet's death, she had her first solo exhibition in Paris. Although we do not have a checklist for the exhibition, we can assume that a work like this would have been done for it. Now, to me, this does not look like a work by an artist who has not been painting for 15 years. This looks like a very accomplished, very practiced, very confident artist, finishing perhaps works that might have been in some stage of completion. Another painting, however, on the right, showing the rose arches over the path, was dated 1924, according to the acquisition records of the Musée des Augustins. This date comes from Michel Monet, according to their records, although the work was given to the museum by Robert Piguet. Hoschedé-Monet's keen gaze may not have just allowed her to express her ideas about the Giverny landscape after Monet's death, but perhaps was actually being played out during those years of working side by side. Another, which has come to light, was dated 1921. If we look at more of Hoschedé-Monet's paintings of the Japanese bridge, we see the subject changing and growing over the years. One of the most visible changes in the foliage is the configuration of the wisteria on the bridge. Fortunately, the bridge was often photographed, so we can document these changes. After the trellis was added in 1904, the wisteria was only trained to grow above the walkway, as you can see in the photograph on the upper left. But in the 1920s, a denser configuration was created with the wisteria entwined on the walkway level and the uprights. These changes over time in Hoschedé-Monet's paintings suggest that she might have been painting it continuously throughout the teens and 20s. If we compare, our now familiar photograph with the footage that Sacha Guitry took that summer for the same film that Degas was in, we get the sense that the photograph was perhaps a trial run for the camera setup for the film. Although Hoschedé-Monet is not visible in the film, it is likely that all the arrangements necessary to get this view of Monet painting were in her capable hands. This suggests that the view we get of Monet in this film and multiple photographs and interviews were not just Monet's sense of theatricality, but Hoschedé-Monet's as well. In the film, we see the changes made from the rehearsal. Monet, now dressed in a neat white suit, standing to paint rather than sitting, the huge palette clearly visible, and the activity of the brushwork, although we never get a clear view of the painting itself. But I'm going to need this. Whoops. Let me go back. Okay. In the beginning of this film, I want you to notice as we pan the pond, the bridge with the wisteria just on the top, and two, not one, but two white umbrellas on the shore. This is just a film still from that same scene. As more of the Giverny paintings come to light, with reason to believe that they were painted or at least conceived over the years previously considered as sacrificed, we may revise the understanding of the period between 1914 and 1926 for Hoschedé-Monet. Rather than seeing it as a time when the painter did not paint, we might consider it a very creative episode for both Monet and Hoschedé-Monet. Again, as Theodore Robinson said, they both like to work together. Rather than just seeing the modern woman versus the angel, we can also get a new appreciation of their conversation that continued for the rest of Monet's life and even after. Thank you.